And I'm doing a lecture today called Aristotle's Politics, Humans Are Political Animals. And I'm talking about Aristotle's claim that appears first in Politics, Book 1, Chapter 2, which is the claim that humans are political animals in Greek. And I'm going to break down the Greek phrase first. But in Greek, Aristotle uses this phrase, ha anthropos phuse politikon zoon. So again, that's ha anthropos phuse politikon zoon. And so when we break that claim down, and again, that's translated as something like humans naturally are political animals, humans by nature are political animals. When we break that phrase down, the first word that we should analyze is the word that appeared first, which is anthropos or anthropos. This is where we get anthropology from, and it's the name of our whole species. Sometimes people will translate the phrase humans are political animals by nature as man is a political animal, but Aristotle's definitely not talking about men in some sense of like gender difference and sex difference. Aristotle really means that our species are political animals. And he does mean the claim in a kind of biological way. The last word in the sentence, ha anthropos phuse politikon zoon, that last word, zoon, is the word from which we get zoology from, zoo biology, these sorts of words. And so when Aristotle's talking about humans being political animals, he really does mean a claim. He really means a claim that is that is like actually like a kind of biological classification. What sorts of creatures are we? And everyone who is a member of the human species is a political animal, a politikon zoon. Now, to be frank, and I will say something about this later, to be frank, Aristotle is excluding many people from this claim. Well, he's excluding many people from full political participation in an ideal polis or city. Some of these people are going to be women. They're going to be men who are fit to be slaves. They're going to be children. They're going to be old people. But like even people who are fit to be slaves are members of a species, and that species is a species of political animals. And so when we read the claim humans are political animals, we need to make it very clear that for Aristotle, humans are that like this is a claim about our whole species. And so there's a question in the chat here about whether ideology warfare is our topic. Not exactly. Aristotle, I think, is really making a claim about what the human species is like. And so his claim is going to be one way of classifying human beings is as political animals. And he's going to mean something very different from just human beings being social creatures. When the claim recurs in Politics Book 3, Aristotle does seem to have in mind us being social creatures, but like bees are social creatures. Horses are social creatures. Ants are social creatures. Humans are not just social or gregarious or herd animals, but humans are actually political animals. And that's going to mean something like human beings can debate. Human beings can debate conceptions of what are good and bad. Do you think he considers our species as emotional species instead of societal creatures is a question. Yes, I do think Aristotle believes that one thing that's distinctive about us is that we're emotional, that that emotions are part of our rationality. Aristotle thinks that that our emotions are ineliminable parts of being a human being. Unlike other ancient philosophers like the Stoics who believe that emotions are defects of our rationality, that when your rational nature is distorted, that's when you're emotional. Aristotle believes that your emotions can sometimes be rational so long as that you feel the appropriate emotion at the appropriate time in the appropriate way. That's an important part of Aristotle's view of what it means to be a human being. So when we go back to this sentence that again in Greek is ha anthropos Fuse, politikon, zoon. I've now said something about the anthropos part and the zoon part. Let's look at the Fuse part. So Fuse is a form of a Greek word that meant nature. So the word in question is phusis. And then Aristotle's using a form of the word that means something like naturally or by nature or with respect to our nature. Now, when Aristotle is saying that humans are naturally political animals, he's staking out a certain view that many other people in the history of political philosophy would disagree with. 17th century political philosophers, especially like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, thought that humans invent governments as a kind of artificial device to solve some of our problems. So I'm thinking of someone like John Locke, who thought that humans, when we're in our natural state, exist without a government, and then we can't enjoy our rights and our private property. We can't enjoy our rights and private property securely. And so Locke thinks that we invent the government artificially to solve some of our problems. Some of our problems. And Aristotle thinks that we invent political communities, city states, we invent the polis naturally, that it's actually part of our nature to have a political community. And that just as beavers create dams by nature, and that bees create hives by nature, human beings create a political community, a polis, a city state by nature. And so by doing so, he's opposing other people who come later that who think that the city state or think that the government exists artificially, for example, to solve some of our problems. So I see a question here in the chat. Would you say he thought our species is culturally based with the family parental authority? Yeah. So I see where you're coming from with this. This is something that many philosophers have thought. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said something like this. For example, much later in the history of philosophy, that in some way parental family relationships are the model on which political relationships should be based. Aristotle, I think, disagrees with that because he thinks that there's something very special going on. Someone like Plato might have agreed with this view too, where family parental relationships provide a kind of special model, and that these are all actually different instances of the same kind of relationship. I think for Aristotle, one very big priority is arguing that there is something special about the human politicalness. The human political life is very different from every other kind of relationship we could observe, whether that's in our species or in other species. And so you point out in the chat that wildlife doesn't, the other animals don't raise their children young. And I agree with that. And I think Aristotle wants to point out how special there is, how special this is when we're talking about humans as political animals. And so when we return to this phrase, the last word in the phrase that I've yet to analyze is politikon. Ha anthropos, fuse politikon zoon. Humans are by nature political animals. Politikon is the word that we're translating as political, and it's clearly related to our word for political. It's clearly related to our word for politics. In ancient Greek, the word for a citizen is a polites, and it's related to the idea of a city state, polis. Now, polis is a perfectly fine translation of a city. A city state is a perfectly fine translation of the word polis. Um, but um, but but I think that political community is probably a better translation of the word polis. And when Aristotle's talking about humans as politikon zoon, human is a politikon zoon, what I think he means is that we are the sort of creatures who flourish and thrive only in political communities. And one of the biggest misunderstandings of this phrase, humans are political animals, is that what Aristotle means is that humans are social creatures. Aristotle is very clear in Politics, Book 1, Chapter 2, that The actual import of this phrase, the actual meaning of this phrase is that humans are animals that debate conceptions of what's good. Humans are capable of rational speech. So there's a comment in the chat about people are religious first, then political by nature, and I think that Aristotle might not disagree with that claim exactly. I think that there are other ways you can characterize as there are other ways you can characterize humans. Famously, Aristotle also says humans are rational animals. That's a big thing. As for the religious in particular, an interesting fact is that ancient Greek thinkers had a word for religion. The word for religion comes from the Latin religio, meaning religion, but in ancient Greek, there is no word for religion. For in ancient Greece, religion was just part of the world around us, and that there wasn't a distinct name for practices governing sacrifices to gods or beliefs that gods existed on Mount Olympus. There's no name for that. There's just an idea that there are these people who exist, Zeus and Athena and so on, and and we can interact with them primarily through the form of sacrifices to appease them. So when we ask, does Aristotle think humans are religious animals in addition to being political animals? I see no reason to think he'd disagree with that, but we're not going to find that claim explicitly in Aristotle because Aristotle doesn't have and no Greek thinker had a word for religion. But again, when we think of the phrase humans are political animals, we should think that Aristotle's making a claim about our species and where we find flourishing by nature. That again, governments are not artificial things. Governments are not artificial things. They exist. They exist as part of things that humans do naturally. City states are not things that humans do invent artificially, but they're part of our natural lives. This is a natural way of life. So before I move on to more of the substance of this claim, I especially want to highlight a thing I alluded to earlier, which is that Aristotle's making a claim about what sorts of creatures we are as humans, as members of our species, but not everyone is going to be capable of political participation in a full way. So the biggest examples here are going to be women and slaves, but I'll say something about two other examples first, namely children and old people. Children and old people are not capable of political participation. When Aristotle thinks about us as citizens, Aristotle thinks about when Aristotle thinks about us as citizens, he's thinking about our participation in elected offices or in offices that are assigned randomly. That was a big thing in ancient Greece, though. A few offices were assigned by election, but also we could participate directly and vote directly on things if we were to go back to ancient democracies. And Aristotle imagines citizens as people who engage in full political participation. He doesn't think that citizens are merely those people who are born into a certain country or something like that, but he imagines citizens as people who participate fully politically. And Aristotle thinks that children and old people are not capable of those activities, but only for a certain amount of time, right? Children will grow out of that defect as they get older. They'll be able to participate fully politically, and old people once were capable of political participation, but now they're no longer able to because of their advanced age. And Aristotle thinks of these two groups of people as incomplete citizens. They're citizens in a limited sense because they're not currently able to participate, but at other points in their lives, they were able to or will be able to. So those are the easy cases to handle. The harder cases are women and slaves. Aristotle believes that women and slaves have reason because they're members of the human species, and humans are rational creatures. And so they're members of species that are able to do this. Yeah, they're members of a species that are able to do this, but they're not able to have reason in the same way that other people will have reason. So, for example, slaves have reason in a way that is able to obey instructions, but they're not the sort of people who should be giving those instructions, and so they're not going to be the sort of people who should be able to participate fully politically. So Aristotle's a very exclusive view of citizenship and political participation in a way that has earned him very few friends over the history of philosophy because of these ideas. Whereas, we tend to view these sorts of ideas as repugnant today, and even in the ancient world, there were many people who disagreed with Aristotle, Plato among them, for example. But still, this is Aristotle's view that while women, slaves, children, old people are members of a species that are political animals, not everyone at every point of their life is going to be able to participate. Um, not everyone is going to be able to participate. So when we go think more about this claim, what does political participation mean? If humans are by nature the sort of beings, the sort of creatures who who are able to and should politically participate, Aristotle, but we might wonder then, what is the actual what is political participation look like? Well, for Aristotle, what it means to be a political animal is specifically to be a creature capable of rational speech. My dog, for example, is able to perceive some things about the world. If my dog were here, she could perceive me and perceive my height, for example. She could perceive my skin, she could perceive my hair, but she wouldn't be able to develop an idea of whether I'm a good or bad person. And Aristotle thinks that this is something distinct to human beings, is that other animals are capable of having ideas and communicating them in some way, right? Animals are capable of having some impressions of the world and communicating them. Chiefly, Aristotle thinks through pleasure and pain, right? My dog, if she felt pain, might bark. She's communicating an impression about the world. But humans, on the other hand, are able to perceive more than just the things that my dog can perceive, and we can communicate these things rationally. So humans are capable of developing a conception of good and bad, just and unjust. And then we debate these things by putting them forward. So I develop a conception of what I think would be right for the United States to do, or for Canada to do, or Athens to do, or Greece to do, or Rome to do. I develop a conception of what's right or wrong. And I communicate that by debating people who have other ideas. And political communities are ways that we actually do this together as a community. That Aristotle would never say that a tyranny is a true political community, because in a tyranny, the rulers rule and no one else ever gets a chance to debate them or to dispute their conception of what's good or bad or just and unjust. And Aristotle thinks that that's an important part of being a human being, is developing a conception of what's good and bad, just and unjust, and then debating them with other people, because then we get to control our own destinies and and have autonomy and control over the direction of our communities. But also we get to scrutinize other people's ideas and have those other people scrutinize our ideas. That's an important part of being a human being. So we can see that although other creatures and other animals are social creatures who live together in packs, bees are a classic example that Aristotle goes back to. Aristotle clearly means something other than just being a social creature. Now, it is true that later in the Politics, in Book 3, Chapter 6, Aristotle does say something again about being a political animal. So he repeats the claim: humans are by nature political animals. And here in this case, Aristotle says that humans are political animals because, among other things, we like to live in groups even when all our basic needs are met. So that does actually sound more like he's saying humans are social creatures, and I'm aware of that. And so Aristotle's not denying that we're social creatures, but he wants to add the rational speech thing as another big idea, as another big point to fill out our conception of what it means to be a political animal. So Aristotle thinks that even if you had someone whose basic needs were met. So let's just think of three basic needs: shelter, food, clothing. You can provide for some of these needs for yourself some of the time. I doubt you could provide shelter, clothing, food for yourself competently all of the time, and perhaps not even for a little bit. But it's true that in theory we could provide some of these things some of the time for ourselves, and that's fine as far as it goes. But one reason why we come together in groups is to satisfy these basic needs efficiently. Um, to satisfy these basic needs efficiently. Now, Aristotle thinks that um, even when all these basic needs are met, still political communities serve some important function. And in fact, Aristotle distinguishes villages from the polis, the city state, the political community, because villages are groups of households that have come together for the satisfaction of basic needs, whereas the polis exists, the city state exists, the political community exists to develop our full selves as human beings, our full selves as human beings. And this is a crucial insight that for Aristotle, part of being a political animal is that we are not complete as living things. We are not complete as living things until or unless we have the opportunity to develop conceptions of what's good and debate other people's conceptions of what's good. And so that is part of what Aristotle means when he talks about a political community and humans as political animals. Specifically, this is Aristotle's account of what it means to be a citizen. A true citizen, he thinks, isn't someone who's just born in a country or whose parents were this way, were members of this country. But a true citizen is someone who participates fully in the political life of a community by debating conceptions of what's good and bad, right? There's a question here in the chat, a point about even children know the difference of good versus evil. I think Aristotle agrees with that point, that children know that there's a difference between good and evil, but many people debate what different conceptions of what is good and bad, right? People disagree about what particular things are good, what particular things are bad. So some people, for example, will say things like, it's that that many people will take stances on controversial ethical questions like abortion, medical assistance in dying, genetic editing, these sorts of questions. People have different answers to these questions. And in Aristotle's world, Aristotle's ideal political community is one where people come together as citizens to debate these things respectfully and to ultimately decide the fate and the direction of their political community. When you're doing so, you are developing some capacities and some character traits. You are developing some capacities and character traits that you wouldn't have a chance to do so if you were living in a different kind of community. And so we should ask this question: what does Aristotle think the ideal political community actually looks like? For Aristotle, the ideal political community is one in which citizens take turns ruling and being ruled. I'll say that again. Aristotle thinks that the ideal political community is one in which we take turns ruling and being ruled. So one day I'm ruling, another day I'm being ruled. One day I'm ruling, another day I'm being ruled, and so on. So it's not hard to see from what I've said so far, why you would want to have citizens have the chance to rule occasionally. Okay. So one reason why it's good to have citizens take the chance ruling is that ruling is an opportunity to prompt us to develop answers to hard questions about what sorts of things are good and bad, just and unjust, and to take a stand on some question and to take a stand on some question, and then put it to the test by letting other people scrutinize that, by entering into a big conversation with other people. And then ultimately, whatever consensus emerges wins the day, and you get to see your ideas put into practice. And that leads to a certain kind of satisfaction that Aristotle thinks we as human beings need to see ultimately. We need a chance to develop ideas and put them out into the world and let them, determine the direction of our community. On the other hand, there are going to be times when you need to develop certain other skills that you can only do so when you're being ruled. So you're going to have to go from days of ruling to days of being ruled, ruling again, being ruled again, ruling again, being ruled again. And one thing that Aristotle thinks is crucial about this is that when we are being ruled, we have the opportunity to be free and think all the time. We have the opportunity to develop ideas in leisure, contemplate without being pressured by the demands of ruling. And so Aristotle thinks that we have the opportunity when we are being ruled. We have the opportunity to be at leisure, to rest. And so when we think about what Aristotle would say is valuable about our societies in which we occasionally exercise political power, but then we also have political power exercised over us, Aristotle would say that it's good that we're not always kept busy with the demands of political office. But Aristotle would absolutely say that one major problem with our societies today is that we as citizens don't get to exercise as much political power as he himself would want us to. For Aristotle, democracy isn't about just putting a name in a ballot box and then walking away and letting the next, few years happen. Aristotle thinks that you really should be more involved in that. For example, you should probably have a say in particular debates over particular pieces of legislation. That's a big thing that Aristotle, in ancient democracies would have been in favor of. But an important part of being ruled for Aristotle is that it frees us up to contemplate and be at leisure. And that's another important part of being a human being. Because even though we are political animals, as I said earlier, we're also rational animals, and rational animals need time to think, right? Rational animals need time to think. And that's an important idea. That's an important idea for Aristotle. When we take a step back and look at this idea of a political community, of Aristotle's ideal political community, we can note that Aristotle thinks that practice makes perfect. When Aristotle thinks about how we become better human beings, his view was often summed up as, in a very cute phrase today, as a fake it till you make it sort of view. Aristotle notes that we're bad at guitar playing. How do you get better at playing the guitar? By practicing the guitar. How do you get better at being a just person? By practicing just actions. How do you get better at being a soccer player? By repeatedly practicing soccer. How do you get better at speaking Spanish? By repeatedly practicing Spanish. Aristotle's idea is that we become better as citizens by practicing political participation, which is why we need to often have the opportunity to do that. But we also need some time to ourselves to think and rest and be at leisure. And when we're being ruled, we have the opportunity to reflect on how we're being ruled. Okay. So Aristotle, we call this in philosophy, Aristotle's view of habituation. Habituation is the process of ingraining new habits in us by repeatedly practicing. We can develop new character traits in us by repeatedly practicing. One of those character traits is going to be being just, being generous, being courageous, being calm, being patient. These are character traits that we have by repeatedly practicing. And Aristotle wants a political system that's going to let us do that. And so, if a political system shuts us out of the political process entirely, then Aristotle will not be in favor of that political process. But if that political process keeps us busy every day of our lives with political things, that's also not going to work. That's also not going to work. Um, there's a question here in the chat. So you think politics is in alignment with our species' well-being? Aristotle would say absolutely. Politics, when it is done well, is in line with our species' well-being. But Aristotle knows, as well as you and I do today, as well as we all do today, that just and good and ideal political arrangements are not normal. And what we need is a political arrangement that gives us the opportunity to study, uh, uh, what gives us opportunities to study and be at leisure, and also gives us opportunity to exercise political right. There's a question here about what my opinion is after studying Aristotle. I think Aristotle is right about some of this stuff, but wrong about others. So I'll mention one of each. I think that Aristotle is wrong when he thinks some people are by nature fit to be slaves and should be shut out of the political community. I think that's something Aristotle is wrong about. Meanwhile, something that I think Aristotle is right about is that when people are given political power in appropriate ways, not just arbitrarily, but when people are given political power in appropriate ways, we have the opportunity to develop some capacities that are necessary for our flourishing and thriving as a species, right? And then someone asks in the chat, how about granting cultural power instead of granting society authority? Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think it's something that Aristotle talks about enough, is the role that culture plays in the trajectory of our species. I think that's something that Aristotle neglects, maybe in one of his lost works, which we don't have. Maybe he would say something else. I'm going to end this lecture and I'll give people the opportunity to ask me questions, but I'll end this lecture by repeating a phrase Aristotle mentions a few times in the Politics. The phrase is that to live outside of a polis, a political community, you would have to be either a beast or a god. To live outside the political community, one would have to be either a beast or a god. That reflects his view that humans are by nature political animals, which, as we see now, is a claim about our whole species. What sorts of creatures are we? We're sorts of creatures who, yes, we're social. Yes, we like to live among other people, even when our basic needs are met. But more than that, we're capable of rational speech, of developing and debating ideas of what's good and bad. And we develop important capacities when we're given the opportunity to rule, and also when we alternate between ruling and being ruled. I hope people enjoyed this lecture on Aristotle's Politics. Humans are political animals. Would anyone like to ask me any questions about this? Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. I appreciate all your comments too. After this lecture, I'm going to go back and reread these comments and see all the things you said, and think about them more deeply. Thank you. Would anyone else like to ask a question, or should I end the lecture here? Thank you. I hope that the rest of you do really well too. I hope that everyone has a nice day. And thank you for tuning into this lecture. If any of you think of any questions, feel free to send me a message. I appreciated your attendance today, and I hope that the people who watch this and listen to this as a recording enjoy this too. And if any of you ever have any questions, feel free to send me a message. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.